Richard Foster, a reclusive millionaire, seemingly had it all: wealth, power, and a life of luxury. Yet, behind the grand gates of his mansion lay a man consumed by loneliness, haunted by the absence of an heir to carry on his legacy. Unwilling to embrace the complications of love or marriage, Richard devised an unconventional solution: hire a surrogate wife for a businesslike arrangement. Julia, a struggling homeless woman, became the unlikely candidate for his audacious plan. But was this arrangement truly transactional, or would it uncover deeper truths about human connection and redemption? Stay tuned as this gripping tale unfolds, revealing the transformative power of love and forgiveness. The winter air was crisp as Richard Foster stepped onto the balcony of his grand estate. Below him stretched acres of perfectly manicured gardens, adorned with fountains that glistened in the pale morning sunlight. His tailored suit hugged his frame as he leaned against the railing, staring at the horizon. Despite the magnificence of his surroundings, Richard's face was a portrait of discontent. At 45, the millionaire had achieved what most could only dream of: immense wealth, a global business empire, and a name synonymous with power. Yet, his heart was a hollow cavern, echoing with the absence of something he couldn't quite name. The sprawling mansion, with its golden chandeliers and endless halls, felt more like a gilded cage. Richard's thoughts turned dark as he sipped his morning espresso. He was the last of his bloodline, and without an heir, everything he had built would one day be scattered to the winds. He loathed the idea of marriage, the vulnerability, the complications, the risk of betrayal. Yet, the thought of leaving his legacy incomplete gnawed at him relentlessly. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, Julia Carter was wrestling with a very different reality. Her worn sneakers scuffed against the sidewalk as she searched for a warm corner to rest. The city's winter chill had seeped through her thin jacket, and the plastic bag she carried dug into her hands. Julia's once vivid auburn hair was now dulled, tucked under a knit cap she had found in a donation bin. Her green eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the streets for opportunity: a kind stranger, a discarded sandwich, anything to get her through the day. Julia wasn't always homeless. Once, she had a family, dreams of becoming a teacher, and a small house filled with laughter. But life had a cruel way of overturning plans. A financial collapse, followed by a tragic accident that claimed her parents, left Julia with nothing. She had spent the past 3 years surviving, not living, her optimism eroded by the harshness of the streets. Fate intervened one bitter evening. Julia sat on a bench outside a bustling cafe, shivering as couples and families passed by, their lives warm and untouched by hardship. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and Richard Foster stepped out, his polished leather shoes clicking against the pavement. He was meeting a business associate, but his eyes caught Julia's trembling form. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard paused. Perhaps it was the way she sat upright despite the cold, or the defiant look in her eyes that mirrored the resilience he admired in himself. He turned to his driver and murmured something before walking inside the cafe. Julia barely noticed him, too engrossed in keeping her body warm. But moments later, the driver approached her, handing her a warm cup of coffee. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to refuse, but the scent of the coffee was too tempting to resist. As she sipped, she glanced at the driver, who simply nodded toward the cafe. Inside, Richard watched from his seat by the window. He had seen desperation before, he dealt with desperate people in boardrooms daily, but something about Julia felt different. That night, as he drove back to his mansion, an idea began to take shape in his mind. It was unconventional, perhaps even absurd, but it might just solve both their problems. A week later, Julia found herself summoned to a high-end restaurant. She sat awkwardly at the table, her thrift store blouse a stark contrast to the elegant ambience. Across from her, Richard Foster exuded confidence, his every movement calculated. "Thank you for coming," Richard began, his voice smooth yet commanding. "I won't waste your time, Miss Carter. I have a proposition for you." Julia frowned, her guard immediately up. "What kind of proposition?" Richard leaned forward, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers. "I want you to marry me." The words hung in the air, absurd and incomprehensible. Julia blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Excuse me. Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Richard said calmly. "This would be a contract, a marriage in name only. In exchange, you would live comfortably, have access to the best care, and, upon fulfilling your part of the agreement, walk away with a substantial sum." Julia's mind raced. "What's the catch?" "You would carry my child," Richard stated bluntly. "I need an heir, and I have no interest in the entanglements of traditional marriage." Julia stared at him, her hands trembling slightly. The offer was both insulting and enticing. Her pride screamed at her to walk away, but the prospect of security and a future, a way out of the endless cycle of poverty, pulled her back. "And if I say no?" she challenged. Richard smirked faintly, respecting her defiance. "Then you're free to leave, no strings attached." Julia spent the next 3 days wrestling with the proposal. Every logical part of her told her to decline. The idea of selling her body and dignity for money felt degrading. Yet, the image of sleeping on cold benches, scavenging for scraps, and constantly fearing for her safety haunted her. This wasn't just about her, it was a chance to rebuild her life. On the 4th day, Julia called Richard. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I'll do it," she said simply. Richard's reply was equally terse. "Good. My car will pick you up tomorrow morning. We'll start with a medical checkup." The next morning, Julia stepped into a world she had never imagined. A sleek limousine whisked her to a private clinic, where a team of doctors conducted thorough tests. Richard stood at a distance, his expression unreadable, as the doctors assured him of Julia's health. From there, she was taken to Richard's estate. The sheer scale of the mansion overwhelmed her: marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and art pieces worth more than she could comprehend. A stylist was brought in, along with a personal chef and a trainer, all tasked with preparing Julia for her new role. At first, Julia felt like a puppet, being dressed and polished for someone else's purpose. But as she saw her reflection in the mirror, a woman transformed from weary to radiant, she began to wonder if this arrangement could be her second chance. Despite the luxury, an unease lingered. Richard remained distant, his demeanor cold and professional. Julia often caught him in his study, poring over documents or making phone calls with a tone that hinted at secrets she wasn't privy to. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more complex than she had anticipated. As Julia settled into her new life, a question gnawed at her: was Richard Foster simply a desperate man seeking an heir, or was there a deeper, darker reason behind his proposal? The answer, she realized, would determine the course of both their lives. The mansion was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Julia wandered through its grand halls, her footsteps echoing against marble floors. Though she had been living there for several weeks, the vastness of the estate made her feel like a guest in a museum rather than the so-called wife of Richard Foster. Her transformation was startling, her once ragged appearance replaced with tailored dresses, styled hair, and flawless makeup. Yet, no amount of luxury could quell the gnawing suspicion growing in her mind. Richard was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He rarely spoke to her outside of their brief, businesslike interactions, and she often caught glimpses of his stern expression, as if he carried a weight only he could bear. One evening, Julia passed Richard's study on her way to the library. The heavy door was slightly ajar, and she could hear his deep voice, unusually sharp and urgent. "I don't care how much it costs," Richard said, his tone clipped. "Make sure it's handled discreetly. No mistakes." Julia froze, her heart pounding. Who was he talking to? And what needed to be handled so discreetly? She leaned closer, straining to hear more, but the conversation ended abruptly. The door creaked open, and Julia stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of a rug. Richard stood in the doorway, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as they met hers. "Eavesdropping, MS. Carter?" he asked, his voice calm but icy. "I was just passing by," Julia stammered, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "The library is that way," he said, gesturing down the hall. "Good night." Julia hurried away, but the encounter left her shaken. The more time she spent in the mansion, the more she felt like she was walking through a labyrinth of secrets. Despite the tension between them, Richard occasionally let his guard down. One such moment came during breakfast a few days later. Julia, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, sipped her coffee as Richard read the newspaper in silence. "Why me?" she blurted out suddenly. Richard lowered the paper, looking at her with mild surprise. "What do you mean?" "This whole arrangement," she said, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "You could have chosen anyone, someone from your world. Why pick a stranger like me?" Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning contemplative. "Because you're different," he said simply. "That's not an answer," Julia pressed, her green eyes narrowing. Richard sighed, setting the newspaper aside. "Fine. You're right, I could have chosen anyone. But most people in my circle are predictable. They're drawn to wealth and power like moths to a flame. I needed someone who didn't care about that, someone who could give me what I needed without ulterior motives." "And you think I don't have ulterior motives?" Julia asked, arching an eyebrow. "I've done my research," Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've been through hell, Miss Carter. You've lost everything, yet you're still here. That kind of resilience is rare." His words, though intended as a compliment, felt more like an invasion. Julia's stomach churned at the thought of being scrutinized, her past laid bare for him to judge. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. The conversation had dredged up memories she had worked hard to bury. She found herself wandering to the garden, a sprawling expanse of flowers and fountains illuminated by soft, golden lights. The air was cool and fragrant, and for a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Richard joined her unexpectedly, his footsteps light against the gravel path. He was dressed casually for once, his usual sharp suit replaced with a sweater and slacks. "I didn't mean to upset you earlier," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Julia hesitated before replying. "It's just strange, having someone know so much about me when I know so little about them." Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on the fountain ahead. "Fair enough. What do you want to know?" Julia turned to him, her green eyes searching his face. "Why does this matter so much to you? The heir, the legacy, why go to such lengths?" For the first time, Richard looked vulnerable. "Because it's all I have," he admitted. "Everything I've built, every decision I've made, it's been for this empire. But what's the point if there's no one to carry it forward? I can't let it all disappear." His honesty caught Julia off guard. In that moment, she saw not the cold, calculating businessman, but a man desperately trying to hold on to something that gave his life meaning. Over the following weeks, Julia and Richard's interactions grew less strained. He began inviting her to join him for meals, and their conversations, though often guarded, revealed glimpses of their true selves. Julia shared stories of her parents, a teacher and a mechanic who had worked tirelessly to provide for her. She spoke of the accident that had taken them away and the spiral of loss that followed. Richard listened intently, his usual stoicism replaced with genuine empathy. In turn, Richard opened up about his childhood, the pressures of inheriting a crumbling business from his father, and the sacrifices he had made to turn it into a global empire. "You and I aren't so different," he said one evening as they sat by the fireplace. Julia gave him a skeptical look. "How do you figure that?" "We've both lost things we cared about," Richard replied. "And we've both had to fight to survive, even if it meant making choices others wouldn't understand." Julia considered his words, her defenses softening. For the first time, she began to see Richard as more than just the man who had pulled her off the streets. But just as she began to trust him, Julia stumbled upon something that reignited her doubts. While searching for a book in his study one afternoon, she accidentally knocked over a stack of papers. Among them was a file with her name on it. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside were pages of detailed information, medical records, photographs, even notes about her movements before they had met. Julia's hands trembled with anger and betrayal. She had expected Richard to have secrets, but this level of surveillance felt invasive, dehumanizing. When Richard returned home that evening, Julia was waiting for him in the living room, the file clutched in her hand. "Care to explain this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. Richard's expression darkened as he realized what she was holding. "Julia, let me." "You've been spying on me," she interrupted, tears streaming down her face. "I thought this was just a business deal, but this feels like something else entirely." Richard took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "I did what I had to do to make sure you were the right person for this arrangement. It wasn't personal." Julia laughed bitterly, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Not personal. You've dissected my entire life like I'm some kind of science project." Richard reached for her, but she stepped back. "I trusted you," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought you were different, but you're just like everyone else, cold, manipulative, and only thinking about yourself." Before Richard could respond, Julia turned and walked out, her heart heavy with betrayal. The fragile bond they had built was shattered, leaving both of them to wonder if it could ever be repaired. Julia stormed out of the mansion that evening, her breath visible in the cold night air as she fought back tears. Her mind raced with emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness she couldn't shake. She clutched her thin coat around her, the biting wind a cruel reminder of the life she had left behind. Had she made a mistake trusting Richard, even for a moment? Meanwhile, back in the mansion, Richard Foster stood alone in the grand living room, his usually composed demeanor replaced with visible frustration. The crackling of the fireplace did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He stared at the empty space where Julia had stood, replaying her words in his mind. For a man who thrived on control, losing her trust felt like a failure he wasn't prepared to confront. Julia checked into a dingy motel on the edge of town. The walls were stained, the mattress sagged, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Yet, it was a place where she could think without feeling watched. She dropped onto the bed and buried her face in her hands, trying to make sense of the chaos. "How did I let it get this far?" she whispered to herself. The file Richard had kept on her was burned into her memory, every page felt like an invasion of her privacy, a cruel reminder that she was just a tool in his grand plan. And yet, despite her anger, she couldn't ignore the moments when Richard had shown glimpses of vulnerability. Was he truly as heartless as she believed, or was there more to his actions than she understood? Back at the mansion, Richard paced his study. His assistant, Carmen, entered cautiously, carrying a tray of tea. Carmen had worked for Richard for years and knew him better than anyone. She placed the tray on the desk and observed him silently before speaking. "Something on your mind, sir?" Richard sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "It's Julia," he admitted. I may have gone too far." Carmen raised an eyebrow, surprised by his candor. "Too far? That's not like you. I've always believed in preparation, knowing every detail before making a decision," Richard said, his voice heavy. "But with her, I might have crossed a line." Carmen hesitated before replying. "She's not like the people you're used to dealing with, Mr. Foster. Maybe it's time you stopped treating her like a transaction and started treating her like a person." Richard looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For a man who had built his life around logic and strategy, the idea of vulnerability was foreign, even frightening. Days passed, and Julia remained at the motel, unsure of her next move. Then, one morning, she felt a wave of nausea that sent her rushing to the tiny bathroom. As she leaned over the sink, a thought struck her like lightning. She rummaged through her bag, finding the pregnancy test kit she had taken from the mansion before leaving. Her hands trembled as she waited for the result. When the lines appeared, her breath caught in her throat. Positive. Julia sank to the floor, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She was carrying Richard's child. Despite her anger and mistrust, the thought of the life growing inside her filled her with a mix of wonder and fear. What would she do now? Could she raise this child on her own, or would she have to face Richard again? Richard, too, was grappling with his emotions. The mansion felt emptier without Julia, and the realization that he might have driven her away for good haunted him. He decided to take action. "Carmen," he said one morning, his voice resolute. "I need you to find Julia." Discreetly. Carmen nodded, already anticipating his request. "I've been keeping an eye on her, sir. She's safe for now." Richard looked at her sharply. "You've known where she is this whole time?" "I figured you'd want to know," Carmen replied, unfazed by his tone. "But I also figured you needed time to figure out what you were going to do about it." Richard exhaled, a mix of frustration and relief. "I need to see her," he said quietly. Instead of confronting Julia directly, Richard decided to write her a letter. He poured his thoughts onto paper, his usually steady handwriting shaky with emotion. "Julia. I owe you an apology, though I know words may not be enough. When I kept that file on you, it was out of fear of making a mistake, fear of trusting someone with something so important. But in doing so, I betrayed your trust, and for that, I am deeply sorry. You've shown me strength and resilience that I've rarely seen in anyone. You're more than just a part of this arrangement, you're someone I admire and respect. I hope you can forgive me, not for my sake, but for the sake of what we've started together. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and discuss how we can move forward, not as strangers in a contract, but as two people trying to do what's right. Sincerely. Richard." Richard handed the letter to Carmen, who promised to deliver it personally. Julia sat in the motel room, staring at the envelope Carmen had handed her. She hesitated, unsure if she even wanted to read it. But curiosity got the better of her. As she read Richard's words, her emotions shifted from anger to something she couldn't quite define, understanding, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope. She agreed to meet him at a small park near the city. The air was crisp, and the sound of children playing in the distance added a layer of warmth to the cold day. Julia stood by a bench, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets, when she saw Richard approaching. He looked different, less polished, more human. His usually impeccable hair was slightly mussed, and there was a vulnerability in his expression she hadn't seen before. "Thank you for coming," Richard said, his voice low but sincere. Julia crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you." "I know," Richard said, nodding. "But I wanted to tell you, face to face, that I'm sorry. And I want to help. Not because of some contract, but because it's the right thing to do." Julia studied him, searching for any trace of insincerity. To her surprise, she found none. "I'm pregnant," she said finally, her voice trembling. Richard's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked utterly unprepared, a rare sight for a man who thrived on control. "I want to do this on my own," Julia continued. "But I'll give you a chance to prove you're not the man I thought you were." Richard nodded, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "You won't regret it," he promised. As they stood there, the weight of their past mistakes lingering between them, both knew that the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, they were willing to try. The days after their meeting were filled with uncertainty. Julia returned to the mansion, not out of forgiveness, but out of practicality. Carrying a child meant she needed stability, and while her trust in Richard was fragile, she couldn't deny that his resources provided the security she couldn't achieve alone. Richard, on the other hand, was determined to prove himself. He adjusted his schedule, spending less time at work and more time ensuring Julia was comfortable. He hired the best doctors to monitor her pregnancy and made arrangements for her to have everything she needed. Yet, Julia kept her distance, her walls still firmly in place. Julia spent most of her time in the sunroom, a quiet space with large windows overlooking the garden. She often sat there for hours, her hands resting on her growing belly as she watched the snow blanket the grounds outside. The house staff kept their interactions polite and brief, sensing her unease. One afternoon, Carmen approached her with a tray of tea and biscuits. "You don't have to stay cooped up here, you know," she said gently, setting the tray on the table. "I like the quiet," Julia replied, not looking away from the window. Carmen hesitated before speaking again. "He's trying, you know. Richard, I mean. I've never seen him like this before." Julia finally turned to face her. "Trying to fix what? He's the one who broke it in the first place." Carmen smiled faintly. "True, but people don't change overnight. Sometimes, they need a reason. Maybe you're that reason." Julia said nothing, but Carmen's words lingered in her mind long after she left. Richard threw himself into becoming a better man. For years, he had been driven by profit and control, but now he sought purpose in ways he never imagined. He began cutting ties with unethical business partners, redirecting his investments into community projects, and funding charities that supported families in need. One evening, as Julia passed his study, she overheard a conversation. "No, I don't want the project to displace those families," Richard said firmly. "Find another solution, one that benefits them as well. We're not just building structures, we're building communities." Julia paused, surprised by his words. This wasn't the ruthless businessman she had come to know. Could he truly be changing, or was this just another performance? Richard decided to take a more personal approach. Knowing how much Julia enjoyed the sunroom, he arranged for it to be redecorated with her favorite colors, soft blues and greens. He also brought in potted plants and cozy throws to make the space feel more inviting. When Julia walked in and saw the changes, she was taken aback. "What is this?" she asked, turning to Richard, who stood in the doorway. "I noticed you spend a lot of time here," he said, his tone gentle. "I thought you might like it to feel more like your own space." Julia's defenses wavered for a moment before she crossed her arms. "You can't buy my forgiveness with plants and blankets." "I'm not trying to," Richard replied. "I just want you to feel at home, even if you don't trust me yet." Julia stared at him, unsure how to respond. For the first time, she saw a flicker of humility in his eyes, a vulnerability that felt genuine. One night, Julia woke up with sharp pains in her abdomen. Panic surged through her as she tried to steady her breathing. She stumbled out of bed, calling for help. Richard was the first to reach her room. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I don't know," Julia stammered, clutching her stomach. "Something's wrong with the baby." Without hesitation, Richard scooped her into his arms and carried her to the car, barking orders to Carmen to alert the doctor. The drive to the private clinic felt like an eternity, the silence in the car punctuated only by Julia's labored breathing and Richard's whispered reassurances. At the clinic, the doctors worked quickly, running tests and monitoring the baby's heartbeat. Julia lay on the bed, her face pale with worry, while Richard sat beside her, holding her hand. "It's going to be okay," he said softly, his usual confidence replaced with genuine fear. "I promise." After what felt like hours, the doctor returned with a reassuring smile. "The baby is fine. It was likely a false alarm caused by stress. But I recommend plenty of rest and a calm environment moving forward." Relief washed over both of them. Richard stayed by Julia's side that night, refusing to leave until he was certain she was comfortable. The scare brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Julia began to see a side of Richard she hadn't before, a man who, despite his flaws, was trying to do better. Meanwhile, Richard realized how much he cared for Julia, not just as the mother of his child, but as a person who had challenged him in ways no one else had. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Richard broke the silence. "I know I've hurt you, Julia. And I know it'll take time for you to forgive me. But I want you to know that I'm not doing this just for the baby. I'm doing it for you, too." Julia looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. For the first time, she didn't find any. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted. "But I'm willing to try." Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I can ask for." A few days later, Julia received an envelope addressed to her. Inside was a letter from one of the charities Richard had funded, thanking her for her generosity. Confused, she approached Richard. "What is this?" she asked, holding up the letter. Richard glanced at it and then back at her. "I made the donation in your name. You've been through so much, and I thought it might mean something to help others in similar situations." Julia's eyes welled with tears. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about his intentions. As the weeks passed, the walls between them began to crumble. Their conversations grew more personal, their moments together more meaningful. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they could build something real out of the ashes of their broken trust. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, casting a golden glow over the living room where Julia sat. Her hands rested on her growing belly, now unmistakably round. The life inside her had become a source of strength and clarity. As much as she had resisted trusting Richard again, his actions over the past months had begun to chip away at her defenses. Richard entered the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He had traded his usual sharp suit for a simple sweater and jeans, a look that made him seem far less intimidating. He handed her a mug and took a seat across from her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his voice low and genuine. Julia looked at him, her green eyes searching his face for traces of insincerity. She found none. "Better," she admitted. "The baby's been kicking a lot lately. It's comforting." A small smile crossed Richard's lips. "That's a good sign." That evening, as they sat together by the fire, Julia finally asked a question that had been weighing on her mind. "Richard, what happens after the baby is born? What do you really want?" Richard stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "At first, this was just about having an heir. I won't lie to you about that. But now," he turned to face her, his blue eyes filled with sincerity. "Now, I just want to be part of something real. A family. Not because I need an heir, but because I want to be there, for you, for the baby." Julia's chest tightened with emotion. She had spent so long feeling like a pawn in his plans that hearing these words felt almost surreal. "I don't know if I can promise you anything, Richard," she said quietly. "But I can promise to try." The months flew by, and soon the mansion was filled with anticipation. Julia went into labor on a snowy evening, the grounds blanketed in white as Richard rushed her to the clinic. The staff worked tirelessly, and Richard never left Julia's side, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Finally, the sound of a baby's first cry filled the room. Julia's heart swelled with emotion as the nurse placed the tiny, wriggling infant in her arms. Richard stood beside her, his usually stoic expression breaking into one of awe. "She's perfect," Julia whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "She is," Richard agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Lily Foster. Welcome to the world." With Lily's arrival, the mansion transformed from a cold, lifeless space into a warm and bustling home. Julia found herself smiling more often, her days filled with the joys and challenges of motherhood. Richard proved to be a devoted father, surprising her with his patience and tenderness. One afternoon, Julia found Richard in the nursery, cradling Lily as he hummed a soft tune. The sight stopped her in her tracks, a lump forming in her throat. She had never expected this man, who once seemed so distant and unfeeling, to become such a caring father. "You're good at this," she said softly, stepping into the room. Richard looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. "I've had a good teacher," he replied, nodding toward her. As the months turned into a year, the bond between Julia and Richard deepened. They worked through their differences and learned to trust each other fully. On Lily's first birthday, Richard proposed again, this time not as part of a contract, but from the heart. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, holding her hands tightly. "But if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. Not because of Lily, not because of the past, but because I love you." Tears welled up in Julia's eyes. She nodded, her voice breaking as she replied, "Yes." Their wedding was a small, intimate affair, held in the garden of the mansion. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and Lily toddled around in a tiny white dress, giggling as guests doted on her. For the first time in years, Julia felt truly at peace. Richard, Julia, and Lily settled into a life that was far from perfect but deeply fulfilling. Richard continued to dedicate himself to his philanthropic work, using his wealth to help those in need. Julia, inspired by her own journey, started a program to support homeless women, giving them the tools and resources to rebuild their lives. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Julia turned to Richard. "You know, I used to think this kind of happiness wasn't possible," she said. "But now, I can't imagine life any other way." Richard wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Neither can I," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they sat together as a family, proof that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to a beautiful future. The journey of Julia and Richard is a testament to the power of change, forgiveness, and love. It reminds us that no matter how broken or flawed we may be, we all have the capacity to grow and build something meaningful. True wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the connections we make and the love we share. The scene begins with a stark contrast, a lavish mansion standing tall against the gray, overcast sky. Its towering gates and sprawling gardens symbolize wealth and power, but within its cold, marbled walls resides a man burdened by loneliness. Richard Foster, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, stands on his balcony, staring blankly into the horizon. His piercing blue eyes are thoughtful, almost haunted, as the winter wind ruffles his dark hair streaked with gray. Below him, the garden seems lifeless despite its immaculate design, a reflection of his internal void. The soft tinkling of a fountain fills the air, but it only emphasizes the oppressive silence of the mansion. Richard's figure, tall and commanding, appears diminished in the vast emptiness of his world. Cut to the streets of downtown, where the world is a different kind of cold. Julia Carter, bundled in a threadbare coat, clutches a plastic bag of her few possessions. Her auburn hair peeks from beneath a worn knit cap, her green eyes sharp but weary. She sits on a weathered bench outside a bustling cafe, watching as people hurry by, their laughter and warm scarves a stark reminder of what she's lost. The contrast between Julia's world and Richard's is striking. His life is one of abundance but isolation, while hers is a constant battle for survival, surrounded by the cacophony of the city. Inside the cafe, Richard notices Julia through the frosted glass. She's huddled against the cold, her hands trembling as she rubs them together for warmth. Something about her catches his attention, a quiet resilience in her posture, a spark of defiance in her gaze. It's a fleeting moment, but it ignites an idea in his mind. The next scene shows Julia hesitating as Richard's driver approaches with a steaming cup of coffee. The man gestures toward the cafe, where Richard sits with an air of detached curiosity, his eyes never leaving her. Julia accepts the coffee reluctantly, the steam rising like a lifeline against the biting wind. Her skeptical expression and Richard's inscrutable one set the stage for the unconventional connection that will soon bind their lives. At the mansion, Julia steps into a world of opulence unlike anything she's ever known. The camera pans across the grand foyer, its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers gleaming under the soft light. Julia's figure, clad in her simple, second-hand clothes, seems almost swallowed by the grandeur around her. Her transformation begins with small, deliberate steps. A stylist's hands work on her unruly auburn hair, smoothing it into a glossy cascade. Her nails, once chipped and brittle, are painted a soft pink, and her thrift store wardrobe is replaced with elegant dresses. Yet, even as she gazes at her reflection in the gilded mirror, a flicker of doubt crosses her face. She wonders if she's losing herself in this new identity. In the mansion study, the tension rises. Julia stumbles upon the file with her name, its contents revealing Richard's meticulous investigation into her life. Her hands tremble as she flips through the pages, medical records, photographs, even notes about her movements before they met. The room is bathed in a warm glow from the desk lamp, but the air feels cold and suffocating. The confrontation between Julia and Richard crackles with emotion. Her voice shakes with anger as she demands answers, while Richard's usually calm demeanor falters under the weight of her accusations. The walls of the study, lined with books and artifacts, seem to close in on them, amplifying the intensity of their exchange. The turning point comes in a moment of vulnerability. Julia, standing in the garden under a sky streaked with soft hues of pink and gold, rests her hands on her growing belly. The delicate petals of winter roses surround her, a stark contrast to the turmoil she feels. Richard approaches hesitantly, his usually confident stride subdued. "I just want to be part of this," he says quietly, his voice carrying both regret and hope. The raw sincerity in his tone breaks through Julia's defenses, and for the first time, she sees the man behind the mask of the millionaire. The final scene is one of warmth and unity. The camera pans over the transformed mansion, now filled with life and laughter. Lily, their baby daughter, giggles as she toddles across the living room, her tiny hands reaching for her father. Richard scoops her up, his face lighting up with a joy he never knew he could feel. Julia watches from the doorway, her green eyes brimming with emotion. The story closes on the family sitting together on the porch, the sunset painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. Julia leans against Richard, their hands entwined as Lily sleeps peacefully in her arms. The once cold mansion has become a home, a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to change. This illustration vividly captures the contrasts, emotions, and transformations of the characters, drawing readers into their journey with imagery that lingers in the mind long after the story ends. The journey of Richard Foster and Julia Carter is a testament to the transformative power of love, forgiveness, and resilience. What began as a cold, calculated arrangement blossomed into a heartfelt connection that healed two wounded souls. Richard, a man once consumed by control and ambition, learned the true value of vulnerability and redemption. Julia, who had endured unimaginable hardships, rediscovered her strength and trust through her willingness to take a leap of faith. At its core, this story reveals that wealth and power cannot fill the void left by a lack of human connection. True fulfillment comes not from material possessions but from relationships built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. It reminds us that even the most broken individuals can find hope and renewal when they allow themselves to grow and change. The birth of Lily symbolizes a new beginning, not just for Richard and Julia, but for anyone willing to face their flaws and embrace the possibility of a better future. Their story encourages us to believe in second chances, to strive for understanding, and to cherish the relationships that bring meaning to our lives. No matter how broken or flawed we may feel, change is always possible. Love and forgiveness are the keys to overcoming our past and building a brighter tomorrow. It is through kindness, self-reflection, and courage that we can transform our lives and inspire others to do the same. Ultimately, the story reminds us that the most valuable legacy is not wealth or power but the love and impact we leave behind.